This candidate was targeting a product manager role at Facebook, and this is probably, I don't know, 4 years old, maybe a little bit older at this point. So, reaching way back into my library for candidates. And the leadership principle that I was targeting in the question that I asked that we're going to go through here was ownership. And specifically from their previous experience, I'd like you to talk about a time where you took initiative that was outside, very much outside of your scope of responsibility, and what was it? What is unique about this specific candidate is how early they are in their career. And I touch on it in my intro to the question, but this I think was they were targeting now their second job out of uni, which is great. It's great. So it's a good lens into what a very early career interview can look like. And if you're in college now, or you're kind of in the middle of your first job and kind of thinking like, how much growth should you have to exhibit? This will be a very good teaching opportunity for you to understand kind of what that level really looks like and what's expected. Things to look for in this interview. How to listen for questions from the interviewer that are telling you you're not quite delivering on what their expectations are for an answer, which then, or should, cause you to adjust the answer that you're given, or the depth of field of the answer that you're given. So that's just something to listen to and pay attention to as the interview progresses. If you want to work with me through a VIP mock interview, or you want access to my content library of all of the hundreds of interviews that I've done, the link is below. All right. Now I recognize a couple things. One, I try to avoid saying the name of the company you're interviewing with, but it's up here. So I'll often refer to it by that company you're going to interview with. That's one. And then two, your work experience is shorter than most people who typically come through this process. And so you can feel free to go as far back as you want in your work, your actual work experience. And if you have to dip into uni, you can do that as well for like some of the project work or whatever. It's fine.
Sure.
Okay. All right. So first off, I'd like to talk about a time when you took on an initiative or a project or whatever that was very much outside of your scope of responsibility. Let's start with what it was, and then I'll have some follow-up questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first projects that I started with straight out of university, so in my corporate role, was so it was beyond my scope in the sense that I eventually ended up managing people who were in the company, had worked at the company for almost 20 years. So that was in that way beyond my scope. Now, how did I get there? Well, the idea of this project was to reduce the bottleneck that was currently going on in the creative side. And what this was the lab. So in our lab, all process flows through the lab eventually. So any creations that go on with the company eventually flow through to the lab. And the lab was the bottleneck, where we had essentially, we were basically told that we were not allowed to add another resource. So that was out of the options. So we were left with just basically changing up the resources that we had and reworking and changing up the flows. So essentially what I did is I broke down a whole bunch of data, qualitative and quantitative, took the brief from the manager to understand what the problem was, and that was the problem I just explained. And then I started to kind of see the problem for myself, went into inspector mode. Very quickly, I found that actually we can do what we're doing with the resources we have. So in fact, it's good news, we don't need a new resource. However, what this meant was managing five operators who were working at the company for 5 years and their manager who had been at the company for 20 years. So all of them, to some degree, averse to change. And more importantly, averse to change from an individual who's literally just started at the company. However, of course, numbers don't lie. Statistics, data, the data sets, even qualitative data from stakeholders outside of that team were feeding me information. And it was that information that I used to make the decisions and the changes that I made. So that was certainly outside of kind of my comfort zone to start with. But eventually we managed to make the changes. The manager was happy to do the changes once he saw the numbers that can happen. And the bottleneck that was no longer existed.
As I said at the intro, this is a candidate who was fairly, like literally first job or one job on their resume in their career. And it's a great learning opportunity for anyone who's in college or younger or much earlier in their careers to how to talk about work that they've done that's on the resume that's likely to get asked about, especially when you have such a small corpus that you're going to get asked about in an interview. And in this question, especially the more junior you are, it's very easy to stumble into taking on more responsibility or more scope than you were originally given. And that's great. It's fertile ground for a good conversation. But it is super important that you as a candidate provide enough information for me, the interviewer, to then kind of ask thoughtful follow-on questions and help provide an opportunity for you to further put the context of the work and just do more data, rationale, walk me through your thinking, etc. If you stay too high level, the surface area that you're now providing to me as the interviewer to attach to and ask follow-up questions becomes small, which is going to cause me most likely to rely on kind of pretty common and generic follow-up questions and not really getting to the heart of what did you do, why did you do it, why was it important, and how did you exceed, and all of the things that help you stand out as a candidate when you're sitting in the chair across from me trying to convince me that I should hire you for a role. So that's really where this candidate could have done a better job, and we'll see how it evolves as his answer continues.
So I guess my first question is, what caused you specifically to take this on?
Okay, so I was working at that point in the lab. So just to give you context, I worked across different functions in my first job. So almost like a trainee scheme. So 4 different functions, 6-month stints. One of those functions was to work in the lab to basically help with the creations, any growth. We had some expansion of the lab, so we also brought in some more equipment, and I was also involved in that. Now, when I was involved in those smaller projects in the lab, and we started to think about bringing in a new resource, there was a lot of back and forth with the manager and the director that, this is the budget, we can't add another resource. So it was at that point that I said, okay, well, let's have a look at the data and let's see how we can go about, is there room for change? Do we have any slack for ourselves that we can create by changing some process? And then that was when I took it on.
So once again, what I'm looking for as the interviewer is enough detail for me to come away from the conversation thinking this candidate stood out to me. Their answer stood out, their rationale, their thinking, their abilities, whatever it is, but they stood out. And again, this answer is pretty high level, and it doesn't really get into any level of depth. He speaks to, let's look at the data. What data? Just like what data? Just get into it. And this is it's a very common trip or pitfall that very early career or kind of less experienced candidates will fall into it. And it's definitely not a red flag. So don't worry about that. It's not one of those red walk away and say, oh, it's a terrible interview, because no, there's a scale. And when you recognize that you've got a young candidate who doesn't have a lot of work experience, they probably haven't done a lot of interviews in their life. There's a lot of things that will cause an interviewer to give grace, but it's an opportunity for you watching this video to kind of learn from this outcome and figure out what is better than this, right? And so if you're going to refer to data, what is the data? What were the numbers? How did you measure it? Like, there's a whole lot of content, fertile ground for you to explore that the candidate just kind of missed out on. And so I'm going to continue to poke at this a little bit as the interview proceeds, but I'm trying to prod him in the right direction to give him the opportunity to stand out.
Okay, so I guess let's start with kind of a more meta question, which is, you're in a 6-month rotation, so it's kind of still we'll call it a training role. Maybe it wasn't identified as training, but as you're moving in and out of roles every 6 months, you're definitely not a long-term player in that role, right? So I would imagine that the perception of your role and your responsibilities were somewhat diminished in that regard compared to the people who'd been there for a long time. So how did you get buy-in from your manager that this is something that you should be doing this, right? Versus someone else on the team. You said there was a manager who was resistant to change, right? So how did you get that buy-in?
So actually, that what you just identified there was exactly the way, because I was to some degree free floating, where I was adding impact where I can. So I like to call it as kind of like a growth consultant. So like I was involved in so many projects across the board where I can add value. So how did I get buy-in? Well, exactly, I was kind of available to do the project and to add that value, and obviously through other projects or through my interaction with the team, also through my ask as well. So Sorry, yeah. So through approaching the manager, saying to him like, I've spent time on the shop floor. I've looked at the operators. I've watched the way they work. I've spoken to them. I've taken qualitative data from them. I think there's room for change. I think we can change something. I think that I understand where we can change and where we can look, and then go given the project to go on with it.
Not to beat a dead horse. Details, details, details. What data? You talked to some people on the floor. Who'd you talk to? What were the roles? What data? What questions? What did you gather from them? You think there's room for improvement? Improvement in what? Based on what? Based on what data? Like, it again, not a red flag. Very early in his career, he was on a 6-month floater program, so he's moving through an organization. He's very early. He's learning. Great, fine. But your job here in watching these videos is to learn how to do it better, right? How to make sure you're remarkable and you stand out in your interview. And this is kind of a swing and a miss in terms of providing an answer that gives me confidence, the interviewer, that you're quite good. Now, it's great that he was able to kind of go and do this and talk to folks that were probably levels above him in seniority and then convince his manager that he should be able to do this. So all of that is weighing in the back of my mind, but I still want to know how he went about the process.
I'd like to understand a little bit more about the data that you analyzed. You made kind of, charitably we'll call it vague reference to qualitative and quantitative data. So it wasn't very specific. So I'd like you to just kind of walk me through the most important quant data that you looked at.
Okay, so the most important quantitative data. So the most important quantitative data that I looked at was how many requests were coming into the lab to start with. So, for example, to exactly identify the bottleneck, how many requests were coming in, and then benchmarking that against our capacity. And how did I benchmark against capacity? Well, I literally went onto the shop floor and collected the data, because for this, the data wasn't hard. It wasn't on the system, because this was just kind of ad hoc. It was just the operators were working with time, and we grew organically. So no manager actually ever took the time to see what is our capacity. So that was the two things I took, and I just worked those two to work with each other. So what was coming in?
And how did you get that? How did you, if it didn't exist, sorry, that took me 3 tries to get to the question I wanted to ask. If the data for capacity didn't exist in the company, how did you go about ascertaining what the actual capacity was?
Yep. So I stood in with the operators with a stopwatch and literally timed, for example, the requests that are coming in, and then took all that data in, for example, subcategorized it as well. So is this what style of request it is? Because we also had 3 styles of requests. And then they were broken down even more. And then all of the different tasks that they would do through the day were timed, compiled, put together, and then compared as well between the operators too, until eventually we had the data set which would tell us on average how much our capacity is if we were to put all our operators together.
And how long were you collecting that data, approximately?
So I collected that for about a week and a half. But every time I collect it, because it wasn't like a week and a half in full, so it was like a week and a half. And every time I collect, I kind of tab in the start time, the end time, and the time of day as well, just because obviously at different times of day, you're getting different styles of data as well.
So there's a lot to like for this candidate. Very early in their career, clearly willing to not be kind of overwhelmed by being tasked with roles they have no experience with, not being burdened with how things have been done in the past and therefore can't think for themselves and maybe identify opportunities for improvement. All of that is great. What is lacking in just across the board in this answer is a depth of field or any presentation of a framework, an analytical framework for how and what data was gathered and how, therefore, the decisions that were made or recommendations that were made. And for this candidate, that would be a key piece of feedback. And again, so early in their career that these are unlikely to be red flags in an interview. I would say that the candidate did a reasonable job of presenting as a kind of L5 product manager. Wouldn't put them in for senior product manager, but definitely, okay, you're an entry-level product manager. But where the answer clearly fell down was the lack of details in their answer. And despite being kind of poked and asked repeatedly, kind of in different ways for data, the candidate didn't pick up on those cues. Now, again, that's probably a function of the candidate has not interviewed for a lot of roles. And so that's understandable. And again, not a red flag, but definitely an opportunity for you watching this video to learn for what to listen for in an interview when maybe you're not quite providing the level of detail or sufficiency in your answer for what the interviewer is looking for. And so there's a baseline expectation for kind of decision making and database decision making when stepping into like a product manager role, especially in a technical arena, that needs to be on display. And this candidate probably wasn't there for most tech jobs, but if it's a teaching organization, this is clearly someone who's got a good head on their shoulders, intelligent, can think through, has presented that they can think through. There's other questions I would ask to try to get to that and really pound the table and advocate for this candidate. But there's clearly enough there that I would say, okay, if we're a teaching organization, this is someone we could probably bring through and teach how to do a better job.